It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us to talk about a documentary that's out in theaters now, and it's going to be getting some more theaters coming soon. It's a documentary on Fr Hesburgh, a past president of Notre Dame. And joining us to talk about it is the director, Patrick Creadon. Thanks for being here, Patrick.
Great to be here, Kyle. Thanks.
So you've done, actually, your repertoire and your past movie history is a pretty long list. Especially, you've done several documentaries that have gotten a lot of attention. What do you like about documentaries?
Oh, boy. I could go on and on about what I love about documentaries. You know, as a young kid growing up in Chicago, I was fascinated by 60 Minutes, and I loved PBS, and I just loved great stories about real people. You know, not to say I didn't love Star Wars, too. That's fun as well. But there's something about, you know, a real person or a real group of people and telling their story well that I find endlessly fascinating. And I was lucky enough to marry a woman who has the same passion. My wife, Christine O'Malley, and I make films together. And we have a real sense of job security because I don't think we're ever going to run out of topics that are just really interesting to us. So I love it. I also love the fact that I think the world needs heroes, frankly. And Christine and I are really drawn to what appear to be ordinary people who do extraordinary things. And that is definitely what we found in the story of Fr Theodore Hesburgh. He lived one of the most incredible lives that I've ever seen. And we are just thrilled that after 2.5 years of making this film, we're finally sharing it with people all around the country.
Yeah. And he was president at Notre Dame during part of your time at the school. What do you remember about him? We overlapped just at the end of his presidency. Now, the rumors that he retired because I was a student there are not true. I just want to speak to that right off the bat. Oh, good. Is that how the movie starts out? Like, just to clarify.
There's no truth to that. I am not signing that idiot's diploma. I'll tell you that right now. No, that's not true. But he retired after 35 years of being the president of Notre Dame when I was a student there. That was my sophomore year. And I will say that my father actually went to Notre Dame, and he was in the class of 1960, and Father Ted signed his diploma. So in a way, I've known about him my whole life. What I didn't know is what we found out when we made the film. Father Ted is one of the most influential and effective leaders America has ever produced. I can say that with a straight face. I would rank him right up there with, with people like Alexander Hamilton. They're from very different eras, and they were faced with very different challenges. But like Hamilton, Father Ted, he was fiercely independent. He was not an elected official. He was never voted into office, just like Alexander Hamilton. And yet the two of them were engaged and asked to basically help figure out some of the most pressing issues and biggest problems of their day. And I would go so far as to say Father Ted actually had even a wider array of problems that were placed in front of him, in part because Father Ted was a Catholic priest. He wasn't just involved in politics. He was obviously involved in religion. He was involved in higher education. He was involved in nuclear non-proliferation, civil rights, immigration. I mean, the list kind of goes on and on and on. And so for us, probably the biggest challenge was, how do we get our arms around this enormous story and tell it in a way that's really riveting and intensely emotional? I'm really proud of the film. It's a real pleasure for me to watch it with an audience who doesn't know what they're about to experience, because it's a very moving story, and it makes me proud to be associated with him because of my association with Notre Dame and association as a Catholic.
Well, and you mentioned all these different areas that he was involved with and had an influence on, but he also worked with so many influential people and powerful people. popes and presidents, Martin Luther King Jr., Dan Rather. You have a whole bunch of people in the documentary. How was he able to draw in these people, very powerful people and connected people from all different perspectives and walks of life?
It's because he knew how to get stuff done. I really think that that's what it all boiled down to. He really came on to the national radar in 1952. It was a long time ago, but in 1952, he was chosen to become president of Notre Dame. He was only 35 years old. He was a young man. But shortly after that, he was asked to be on the National Science Board. He was asked by the Vatican to be an ambassador to the nuclear nonproliferation efforts that were taking place in Europe at the time. And in both of those cases, he really turned heads. And one of the heads he turned was President Eisenhower. He saw in Hesburgh a leader. He saw a decent, kind, very hardworking man, and who said, I want that guy to be on my team. And so what ended up happening, and remember, just to give some perspective, Dwight Eisenhower knew a thing or two about big problems. He went over to Europe and basically won the war. He is probably, more than any other figure, the person responsible for defeating Adolf Hitler. And he came back home in 1945. This is President Eisenhower. He came back home in 1945. And the only job he really held between 1945 and becoming president in 1953, in that window there, he had one job that he held, which was he was a university president. Dwight Eisenhower was the president of Columbia University at that time. I think the fact that Father Ted brought a lot to the table and that he was also a university president, that combination of things, I think, made Eisenhower realize this is a guy that I like and this is a guy that I trust. And if there was one problem that America really could not figure out how to address and how to pave the road forward, it was the problem of civil rights. In the mid-50s, this is another thing, and not to get too off track, but remember, President Eisenhower was in the trenches with white soldiers and black soldiers. He took the best people that he could find to go out and win the war. And yet those white soldiers and those black soldiers really returned to two different Americas. There was a white America and there was a black America at the time. And President Eisenhower knew that we have got to figure out how to make this one country. And so he created the Civil Rights Commission in 1957 and chose 6 people to be on that commission and to figure out exactly what the problems were and figure out what to do about them. And Father Ted Hesburgh was one of those 6 people.
We're talking with Patrick Creadon, the director of the documentary Hesburgh, and it seems like his legacy is at least somewhat mixed and maybe even controversial. Do you address that in the film at all?
Absolutely. You cannot live in the public arena for basically 50 or 60 years and not be engaged in some controversies. And Father Ted was certainly somebody who had to make tough decisions every day. We definitely looked at that. We definitely looked at what were the really tough choices he had to make, and were those the right choices or were they the wrong choices? And I can honestly tell you, in our objective research and our objective retelling of the story, he was someone who didn't have any regrets. He simply did what he thought was the best thing to do in every given situation, and he made those choices based on what was right and what was wrong, and moved forward. Now, the one thing about him that I find really fascinating is that he was a Catholic priest, but he was also a university president. Those two jobs oftentimes came into conflict with one another. So as a priest, he took a vow of obedience. And if Rome told him to act a certain way, it was expected that he would act a certain way. However, as a university president, he stood for freedom of speech. He was against censorship. And so oftentimes his two jobs came into conflict with one another. But I can tell you that as a leader and as a university president and as a Catholic priest, he makes me proud. I look up to him. I think about him every day. I've spent 2.5 years now telling his story, and he's a tremendous role model, and he's somebody who is going to have a huge impact on my life for the rest of my life.
In what way?
He had that ability because there were two things. He knew the difference between right and wrong and always chose to do things the right way. That's number one. It sounds really simple, but sometimes that's really hard to do. That's number one. And number two is, I call it his superpower. He was a very kind man. And what we're finding right now in this American moment that we live in is that kindness is a quality that seems to have kind of been left behind. I think the leadership in our country, in both parties, and there's a lot of blame to go around. I think that this idea of kindness is kind of associated with weakness.
Right.
This idea of compromise is almost a dirty word. Well, guess what, folks? That's what a democracy is. And that's how this country, this sort of miracle of an experiment in governance, came to be, is through compromise. And in understanding that you don't always get what you want, but you're going to live to see another day. And we're losing that. We're losing that right now. So what's ironic about this story is that this is a story about a Catholic priest who died several years ago. He probably did some of his best work in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, right? So it seems like, I don't know, it seems like a story that happened a long time ago, and yet it's the most timely story we've ever told. His leadership style and the way that he chose to solve problems, it resonates right now. We seem to have found ourselves in a moment in time here where it's the bully who kind of gets what they want. And again, I'm not even thinking of one particular person or one particular party. It's the loudest voice. It's the angriest voice that tends to win the day. And it's really sad. And I think we need to wake up from this nightmare that we find ourselves in.
Yeah. Well, the trailer looks so good. I can't wait to see it. People definitely check out the trailer, but also the movie is available and it's in theaters already in South Bend. It's been out since April 26th, and it's going to be nationwide May 3rd. So where can people find out more about the movie, watch the trailer, and find out when and where to watch it?
The website is hesburghfilm.com. Right away, it'll show you, where's it playing in my town, where will I buy tickets, etc. I got to warn you, bring your tissues. It's a funny, fascinating story, but it's really powerful, and parts of the story that are very, very moving. And I will say, the last thing I'll just add is that what is so rewarding for me is that our goal was not to make a Notre Dame movie and not to make even a Catholic movie. Our goal was to tell an American story that people from all walks of life can relate to. And based on the screenings that we've had at film festivals and the private screenings we've had leading up to our release, we've done that. People walk into the movie theater having no idea who this is, probably grumbling to their spouse or their date, "Why did you drag me to this film?" And they walk out really deeply moved and inspired by what was just an extraordinary life of Fr Theodore Hesburgh.
All right. Well, encourage people to check it out. Again, the movie's called Hesburgh, and you can find more information at hesburghfilm.com. Thank you so much, Patrick, for sharing with us today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Kyle. It's great to be here.